Hello, and welcome to GRCC's Tutor Training module on Tutoring Multilingual Students. Before we begin, let's quickly review the four main objectives of this training. Our first goal will be to discuss why learning to tutor multilingual students is important. Secondly, we will introduce terminology and trends that pertain to tutoring these students. Third, we will reflect on our own attitudes and assumptions and how they can affect tutoring sessions. And finally, we will take a look at some of the best practices and approaches in the field. First, let's talk about why it's important. In recent years, GRCC has experienced an increase in the number of students who speak languages other than or in addition to English. As a result of this change, it is important for tutors to be equipped with the necessary skills to help these students achieve success. Keep in mind that not all multilingual students require extra time or help when performing academic-related tasks. However, some of them do, and that's why it's important for you, a GRCC tutor, to have the knowledge and skill set to provide these students with the best possible tutoring experience. Learning how to tutor multilingual students is important for another reason too, one that might impact you beyond your time working as a tutor at GRCC. The landscape is changing in the United States. Our country, and by extension education, is becoming more multicultural and globally minded. At virtually all levels, from K through 12 through higher education, there is a need for people who are knowledgeable about and who are trained to work in such capacities. Let's review some terminology. You've probably noticed that we refer to students who speak English as a second language as multilingual. This is an umbrella term that we will talk about more in a few moments. For now, let's look at some terminology that is commonly associated with this population of learners. ESL. This is an acronym for English as a Second Language, probably the most frequently used term you will come across. The classes at GRCC are also called ESL, as they are at most other area high schools and colleges. However, when used accurately, ESL has a very specific meaning, one that is about where English is taught to non-native speakers rather than how. In the narrow sense of the term, it refers to English taught to non-native speakers in a country where English is frequently used. So, if a multilingual learner was studying English in the U.S. or in Britain, it would be correct to call them ESL. Another common acronym is EFL, which stands for English as a Foreign Language. This refers to English taught to non-native speakers in a country where English is not the primary language. For example, if a learner were taking a class in academic English in Mexico or France, it would be called an EFL class. Perhaps surprisingly, the distinction between the two might be important. ESL classes are often practical in their goals and focus on speaking and listening more than reading and writing. This is because these classes are taught in English-speaking countries, so the students' goals will often be applied outside of the classroom in the real world. EFL classes, on the other hand, are often more academic, focusing on reading and writing. Students in these classes have less opportunities to practice what they learn since they are taught in countries where English is not a primary language. If you have studied a foreign language here in the United States, think about how challenging it was to use what you learned in your day-to-day life. EFL students face that same challenge. An advantage of an EFL classroom, however, is that students can converse and discuss issues with each other in their native language, as can the instructor. Students in an ESL classroom come from multiple backgrounds and do not have this same advantage. The likelihood that the instructor is conversant in all the students' native languages? Slim to none. Another term that is useful to know is Generation 1.5. This refers to learners who have spent part of their upbringing in their native country and part of their upbringing in the U.S. Oftentimes, these learners are graduates of U.S. high schools, speak English in their everyday lives, but speak their native language at home. What's important to know about these learners is that while they will often have excellent speaking and listening skills, sometimes indistinguishable from native speakers, these students frequently have challenges with reading and writing. To recap, ESL, EFL, and Generation 1.5 are important terms for tutors because they remind us that English is learned in a variety of ways and places, and by a variety of different populations. Our multilingual students might have grown up in the U.S. or in a different country. Their knowledge about U.S. culture might vary. Some will speak English like a native speaker, while others will have trouble expressing themselves. And finally, some of our multilingual learners will have advanced academic skills, while others will struggle to comprehend the basics. In short, no single individual can capture our multilingual students' experiences, needs, or goals. These learners are every bit as diverse and complex as our native English-speaking students, hence the term multilingual. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about some myths about multilingual students. Myth number 1. Multilingual learners are a homogenous group with little diversity. As you've already learned, this is not the case. In fact, they are an extremely diverse population with a host of interests, experiences, challenges, and needs. Their experiences learning English are also highly diverse. Some learners will have had formal classroom training, while others have learned it in the home or in a community setting. Still others will have had a mixed experience. Myth number 2. Multilingual students learn English in the same way. As we've seen, this is patently not the case. The location of where a student first studied English can impact how they were taught the language. But there are other important variables to consider as well, such as the age of the learner, his or her first language, and even their socioeconomic and political status. These can all have an influence on how they were taught English. Myth number 3. Learning English as a second language is the same thing as learning a new vocabulary. While vocabulary is important, learning a new language goes far beyond mere words. Students need to learn the forms and structures of the language and the relationships between them in order to effectively communicate. Students also need the opportunity to express and engage each skill set of the language. This means for students to truly learn a language, they must have opportunities to practice reading, writing, and listening skills, not just speaking. Myth number 4. Multilingual students make the same mistakes. The truth is that there is a wide variation in the types of mistakes which multilingual students make when speaking and writing. These mistakes may vary from individual to individual and often depend on the student's first language. For example, native Arabic-speaking learners will often write run-on sentences and forget to use punctuation, while native Chinese-speaking learners will have challenges with verb tense and articles, such as the, an, or a. This is because the Chinese language doesn't have verb tenses or articles, or at least not in the way that English does. Still, just because we can predict some of the possible mistakes students might make, the variety of mistakes will almost always outweigh the similarities. Myth number 5. Multilingual students have the same challenges as developmental students. Although it might appear on the surface that these students face the same obstacles, when we probe deeper, we learn this is seldom the case. Many developmental students' academic struggles derive from underlying emotional and cognitive issues. Multilingual students, on the other hand, are typically challenged by the language itself. Struggling with a second language is not in itself an indication of cognitive or emotional challenges. It simply means that it is a difficult undertaking for most people. We know this by tracking the success and aptitude multilingual students display in their native languages. Now, let's move on to some practical tips and strategies we can use while tutoring multilingual students. The first tip is to establish rapport. As tutors, we want to build a trusting, comfortable relationship with our students. We do this by showing enthusiasm and being attuned to their needs, by inspiring confidence and offering appropriate praise, and by learning about the assignment at hand. An example of a tutor working hard to establish rapport is greeting the student warmly when you first meet. "Hello, how are you today? It's very nice to meet you." Little greetings like these, when expressed sincerely, can make a student feel comfortable about coming into your lab. An example of offering appropriate praise might take the form of commenting on the student's success. "That's an excellent point you made here," or "Nice job on that equation." Interactions might not seem like such a big deal, and they might even come second nature to some of us, but they are nevertheless very important for students to hear and experience. Establishing a trusting, healthy relationship with your student will often make him or her feel safe and respected, which, in turn, can enhance their learning experience. Tip number 2. Be clear on your role and the role of your student. It is important to be clear about, at the outset, who is responsible for what. If it's the student's first time in the tutoring lab, You'll want to make sure they have a good grasp of the Tutoring Lab's philosophy. In the case of GRCC, this means letting the student know your job is to guide the student to improving their assignment and not simply offer the right answer. You'll also want to get a sense of the student's expectations and goals. That way, you can determine how they fit with your lab's philosophy. This will also help you stay on task. Making a plan at the outset can be helpful as well. Reviewing 2 or 3 goals that you and the student will work toward will help you both stay on task and manage expectations. And lastly, make sure to hold high standards for the student. It's our job to try to bring out the best in the students we work with. There are some simple ways you can clarify your roles. For example, ask the student if he or she has been to your lab before. If they haven't, you might say something like, "Let me take a moment or two to explain our approach here," and then give them a brief overview. If the student has visited the lab before, it might not be a bad idea to gauge their understanding by asking them to briefly explain their experience, or even their understanding of how your lab works. Discussing student expectations can unfold similarly. So, what do you hope to accomplish today? What exactly do you want to work on? Questions like these can help you figure out what students expect to accomplish and to formulate a plan for doing so. Some tutors find it useful to take the additional step of explicitly going over a plan point by point before they start the actual tutoring. You might say something like, "Let's take a few moments to write down 2 or 3 of the things we want to work on today." That way, we'll be clear on your learning goals and can stick to them as we move throughout the session. Holding high standards for the student is something you'll want to do throughout the session, not just at the beginning. Tutors can do this by gently pushing students to work toward the goals identified in the plan. By asking leading questions and offering encouragement, we can help the student find success. Try saying something like, "I know this problem is challenging, but let's not give up on it just yet." Remember though, the key here is not to let students turn over responsibility to you, the tutor. It is our job to guide them toward success, not do the work for them. Clarifying roles, discussing expectations, and making a plan are very important to the tutoring experience. If students and tutors are not clear about who is responsible for what and why, the tutoring session can become confusing, even frustrating for both the tutor and the student. Once these things are clarified, however, the tutor and student will both know what they need to do to make the session successful. The same goes for holding students to a high standard. If we do our best to encourage students to do as much of the work as possible, they will learn a lot more in the long run. Our third tip is to maintain clear communication with your student. Given that many of our ESL students struggle with speaking English, it is of the utmost importance that we regularly check to make sure they comprehend the conversation at hand. When communication falters, so does learning, so we must be vigilant in this respect. We can do this by periodically checking with our students. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions? Can you try to explain that back to me? By asking these simple questions, we can determine whether our student understands what we intend to communicate. Using notes and diagrams can be effective too. This gives both the tutor and the student key vocabulary and reference points to return to if communication falters. For example, if there is a key word or phrase you find your student is struggling to use or remember, go ahead and ask the student to write it down on a piece of paper so they can quickly make reference to it. Checking comprehension also means that you should make sure to address missing background knowledge. If there are ideas or concepts in the assignment that make assumptions about historical or cultural knowledge, spend a few minutes to review these with your student. An example of this might be a reference to, say, a well-known political figure in the U.S., or the use of a word or phrase that has a certain historical connotation. When you see things that require knowledge that is specific to U.S. culture and history, ask your student if he or she knows what it means. If they don't, take a minute to review it with them. Maintaining communication with ESL students might be the single most important practice you can incorporate into your tutoring skill set. When communication breaks down, learning almost always seizes up as a result. However, if you follow these simple tips, you are likely to succeed in keeping the channels of communication open and smooth. Finally, we should be mindful of how we finish or close a session, as this too can have an impact on the success of the session. Remember to encourage the student to reach out to their professor. especially if they are confused about an assignment or the feedback they received. In many countries, particularly those steeped in tradition or those who observe strict rules about social and professional roles, students are not encouraged to make contact with professors outside of class. As a result, our international students might not be aware that the culture of higher education in the U.S. actually encourages this practice. So, if you sense your student would benefit from talking about a specific assignment or concept with their professor, by all means encourage them to do so. You might even review the syllabus to help your student find the professor's office hours and location. Make sure also to remind them this is a common practice and that professors welcome the opportunity to visit with students one-on-one during office hours. Another thing you might do is encourage students to make periodic visits to your lab. The more often they come to get help with their assignments, chances are the more successful they will be in their classes. For example, when the session ends, you could remind them about your lab's days and hours of operation and encourage them to come back in the near future. We'd love to see you again. Feel free to come back anytime you have a question. You could also inform them about the connection between academic success and tutoring. Most of our students who come back to the lab regularly improve their grades. You should think about coming back later in the week to review your next assignment. Encouraging students to return to your lab for even small assignments and questions is a good practice to assume. Although we, as tutors, might take the importance of our craft for granted, it's important to remember not all students think along these lines. This might even be more true for our international students who hail from places that might not have these types of educational resources for learners. Remember to make sure to end on a positive note as well. Tutoring inherently focuses on those things students will have trouble with, and some of our sessions might feel overly preoccupied with a student's problems. Therefore, it's a good idea to try to end on a high note to help boost students' confidence. You can say something like, "You made a lot of progress today. You should feel proud of your achievement." Or, "I am very impressed with how hard you worked this afternoon." Ending on a positive note is a good practice to assume regardless of a student's background. But it's all the more important for ESL students who can sometimes feel shy or intimidated about using English. If we can help them feel successful and competent despite their language struggles, they will feel good about tutoring and about their learning. And finally, make sure to review the main ideas you covered with your student. Giving the student the opportunity to revisit core questions and issues from your session will increase the likelihood of their learning and growth. In doing this, it's a good idea to take the last 3 or 4 minutes of any session and go over the concepts covered. As you do, make sure to ask your student if they have any questions or concerns about the material covered. Let's take a moment to review your tutoring checklist. 1. Make sure to establish rapport with your student at the outset. Helping the student to feel at ease during a tutoring session sets the stage for success. 2. Clarify your roles. Remember, it's important for both the tutor and student to be clear on what each person is responsible for. 3. Be mindful about maintaining open and clear communication. Checking for comprehension by periodically asking questions is a useful way to do this. And finally, close your session in an effective way. Reviewing the main ideas and concepts you covered with the student is a great way to increase their learning. The last thing we are going to do in this session is share some student perspectives. For this training, we interviewed 6 multilingual students at GRCC to find out what, in their words, were the most effective tutoring practices. The first thing our group mentioned was the importance of communication. Several of them discussed how important it was to make sure that the tutor speaks at an appropriate speed and uses language that the student can understand. "Sometimes I get lost when the tutor talks," a student from China said. "They need to speak slowly when explaining new ideas, especially new vocabulary." Another suggestion from the group had to do with the type of instruction. While they understand the importance of having the student do some of the work, they feel that putting too much responsibility on them can be counterproductive. A student from Eritrea remarked, "There are tutors who only ask questions. This can be helpful, but only if I know part of the answer. There are times when we first need to be told or shown what to do." The last and probably most important suggestion offered was for tutors to be patient. "It's very important that we have an opportunity to go slow," a student from Peru said. Sometimes I have to translate ideas from my first language into English in order for it to make sense, and that can take time. A student from Lebanon agreed. If I don't have the chance to go at my own pace, I won't learn anything, he said. The tutor needs to understand this. In fact, if a tutor knows only one thing, it is that. Be patient and let the student set the pace. We hope this training has been useful and somewhat interesting for you. If, in the future, you have questions or would like some advice, be sure to ask your supervisor. Please turn in your responses to the corresponding assessment. Thank you for your time and attention.